afternoon. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's session despite the many other activities in UP and outside. Happy Arts Month. We are nearing the end. Congrats to all the cultural workers who have worked hard for this February to happen. So, we are here to the second session of Talakayan sa Bulwagan, the Bulwagan ng Dangal University Heritage Museum's long-term public program that aims to open discussions that stem from various concepts and practices operating within and emanating from the intersecting contexts of the Bulwagan and Dangal museums, universities, and heritage work. It is envisioned as a more sustained effort to providing opportunities for learning and discussion among museums and cultural workers in the campus and in the art community. The first two sessions of the program focus on the notion of equity, which is a key idea in the theme of this year's UP Diliman Arts and Culture Festival titled Kalahok ng Nagbabagong Kalikasan. These sessions are organized in partnership with the UP Theater Complex and supported by the UP Office of Initiatives in Culture and the Arts. The inaugural session, Accessibility and Inclusive Practices, centered on making culture and art accessible and inclusive in relation to disabilities. Speakers, architect Enrico Abordo, Ms. Carol Manalastas of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and Ms. Myra Medrada from the Deaf Performing Circuit shared inspiring examples and efforts that challenged us to be more intentional in our accessibility and inclusivity intentions. For this afternoon session, we hope to cover questions, ideas, and actions on the role of art and culture in contributing to climate awareness and how artists and creatives utilize art, art making, and lived experiences in foregrounding ecological mindfulness in their contemporary practices. Through the conversation this afternoon, we hope to contribute to and acknowledge the necessity of education from an ethical collaboration with communities, especially indigenous peoples and knowledges, by learning from the artistic endeavors to be shared by our panelists. We also hope to unpack the intertwined relationship of sustainability, equity, and justice as an urgent cultural and artistic agenda. To initiate the dialogue, we are happy to share a pre-recorded lecture video of our keynote presenter, John Kenneth Paranada, who is the Curator of Art and Climate Change at the Sainsbury Center, supported by the John Ellerman Foundation, the first position of its kind in a UK museum. He is also a researcher at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of East Anglia. Born and raised in the Philippines, Paranada is dedicated to bridging disciplines through collaboration, research, curatorial practice, and exhibitions, creating pathways towards a regenerative and resilient future to confront the greatest challenge of our time, anthropogenic climate change and environmental collapse, and to bring active hope to communities and institutions alike. Ken is an inaugural jury member for the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Art and Environment Prize at the Museum of Contemporary Art, LA, and serves as a jury member for the Lumen Prize. He is a board member or board advisor for East Gallery at Norwich University of the Arts and a member of the Climate Change Working Group for the Association of Art History London. Mr. Kenneth Paranada.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Mark Louis Muge and Con Cabrera and Karina Mirin. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation with you all. I'll be presenting a 20-minute type of presentation. It's basically case studies of what we've been doing at the Sainsbury Center. It's a museum in Norfolk, in the United Kingdom. So my name is Ken. I'm the Curator of Art and Climate Change at the Sainsbury Center. To contextualize, it's the first museum role that highlights the importance of discussing this very big question on climate and adaptation and the problems of the climate crisis, and how we're addressing that through the interface of the museum, or through the museum space as a place for dialogue, as a space for education, as a space for accessing knowledge and different types of experiences. So my slide, the first one, is basically just me introducing what I do. So the role is basically tied to the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. And that is a research institution that focuses on climate policy, how do we legislate all of this knowledge or all of this data we've gathered about climate change into actual legislations or laws that we could follow to ensure that the future will be a sustainable one, rather than a really kind of, as we know, humans are quite greedy and we need to wean off from fossil fuel. And this is like the first step to cleaning up what we've done in the last 200 years, for example, or more. I also have some maps, because it's always good to contextualize where we are. Obviously, I'm originally from the Philippines, but I kind of moved to the UK back in 2015. And since then, I've been working as an independent curator and also worked in different institutions, kind of doing loads of different curatorial practices, but always with its focus on sustainability and climate change. And so in terms of kind of my role as the curator of art and climate change, it involves the museum, which is kind of called the Sainsbury Center. And we have a collection of different art, different objects spanning from prehistory all the way to the contemporary moment. And some of the treasures from the collection are the Francis Bacon, but we also have indigenous masks and different objects from Oceania, Africa, and South America. But it's not as obviously extensive as the British Museum. This one is basically just part and parcel of several different ethnographic and autochthonous objects from across the globe. And obviously we acknowledge that all of these objects were brought about because of empire. And now we're using all of these objects to study the human condition and study to culture in general, and how we could build mutual understanding of each other and live with this very kind of sustainable world where we disagree with each other's culture, but we still agree in principle why we're doing all of these things in different contexts. And so plurality of understanding is basically the key I wanted to kind of pin down in there. So as the curator of art and climate change, we had to do loads of dialogues with scientists, with policy advisors, with community groups. And because the whole idea of the role is to create a network of interested kind of individuals, but also institutions to start thinking and creating a roadmap towards how do we kind of like make use of the power of art, the power of culture. And the power of culture is obviously kind of deeply seated in the human condition. This is like how we look at the world. This is how we look at what is beautiful. This is, kind of like it goes back to our understanding of our role in the universe or in the world in general. So it has all of these philosophical questions. And so at the Tyndall Center, we try to kind of like create a story to kind of galvanize people to be part of the action. Because obviously in a Trump presidency, this is like harder because you have a government that denies the effects of human-made climate change. And obviously we don't want to go political, but Trump actually wants to drill more in Alaska, right? And so what does that do to the melting ice caps there and all of those indigenous folks already affected by the climate upheaval happening in those areas. And so the climate change curator kind of creates all of these exhibitions, but also programs that coincides with it. And one of the key things I want to kind of like research along with my role is this idea of the Anthropocene traps. And these are kind of like how museums curate and tell the story of human-made climate change, because obviously we need to make a distinction. Climate change is like a natural occurrence in the planet, right? That's kind of like a geological discourse and very hard science type of conversation. But then when we talk about human-made climate change, that one I think we could agree on that this has been happening since industrialization, or probably since empire was established, when all of this types of kinds of violence happened in indigenous lands, the land grabbing, the ethnic cleansing, and all of this violence in history, right? Slavery, all of those things cost, a tremendous type of capitalistic society that created, all of this desire for more, the desire to kind of like have iPhones every year. And the impact of that is obviously exploiting the planet, mining more mountains. Now we're actually thinking of going under the sea and, mining all of this nodules. And again, we're not thinking how will that affect the marine life and all of this creatures that lives in those, places. And so these are like the thinking we have at the Tyndall Center, and kind of translating those stories into art, but in the expanded form of art as well. And it's all kind of like heavily focused on communities and collaboration. Again, to kind of just like give you a background of the Sainsbury Center collection, and it was established, or it opened to the public in 1978. It was donated by Robert and Lisa Sainsbury. They are from a family of grocery tycoons, and so they collected all of these beautiful objects and donated it to the University of East Anglia. And they commissioned an amazing architect, Norman Foster. And so this was his first museum. And after that, he created all of these other fabulous modernist buildings out there. And in terms of collaboration, I'm also linked closely to the Environmental Humanities Department at the university. And so we all have kinds of programs that goes into climate, literature or climate narratives, and how, the whole idea of culture is that it's in different forms. It's in writing, it's in visual culture, it's in performances, it's in, all of these things that we haven't probably thought about. And now it's time to just like link them together. And obviously we're also addressing the United Nations Climate Development Goals. And usually in a program that I do, I try to hit at least 3 or 2 in the goals to kind of, talk about it, or create an exhibition and types of different programmings that addresses and make people question about our ways of existing, our ways of government, and how we could make those things sustainable. Because the more we ask questions, the more we become kind of we get more kind of like cogitation and thinking when we ask questions, and this makes it more informed in a way. And obviously, if you have a dialogue and it's not an echo chamber, you create a better type of understanding and creating solutions of addressing a very big problem. So as I've been mentioning from the get-go, collaboration is at the heart of what we're trying to do at the Sainsbury Center. And so this is like pedagogy, design, architecture, engineering, eco-innovation, communication. And obviously, we also want to work with climate activists like Extinction Rebellion and other kinds of activist methods. But we want it to be more, kind of an open forum wherein other voices could also participate rather than just like a very one way of looking at the problem. And so it's all about a holistic approach. And that's why we kind of like do loads of different programmings highlighting indigenous knowledges and stories, and highlighting the plight of kind of like the global south as kind of the exposure to climate change. The impact of it is much felt in the global south rather than the global north that caused the whole kind of climate catastrophe. And this is scientific. This has been proven, and obviously there needs to be some form of climate justice in this conversation. And how do we do that? It's through empowering indigenous voices that has been left out from the conversation on the climate crisis, because obviously they're the ones who've been protecting indigenous lands for several centuries, and because of empire they were displaced, and those kinds of like lands were transformed into hubs of industrial capitalistic endeavors. So to kind of like go on to the case studies bit of this presentation. So for the first exhibition I did at the center, it was titled Sediment Spirit, the Activation of Art in the Anthropocene. And this was part of our Planet for Our Future, Can We Adapt to a Transforming World season. And so at the Sainsbury Center, we have question-based kind of seasons, and each of the questions are very big. And that is kind of like, not just relevant to the global north, but it implicates everyone from the world, even the global south. And so we wanted to be as big, the question to be as big as possible. So the first question we asked was, climate change themed, and it was, how do we adapt to a transforming world? And so I've invited Claudia Martinez-Garay. She's an indigenous artist from Peru, to come to the Sainsbury Center and look at our collection of Peruvian artifacts. And when she was here, we went to the British Museum, for example, and because she wanted to look at Peruvian mummies, which is in the bioarchaeological collection of the British Museum. And so this is like a sensitive object, and that means you need a special permit to access it. You can't take a picture of the mummy. You can only go there to probably sketch, and that's it. And so we did that as part of the kind of residency. So she kind of like wanted to converse with her ancestors, and so we got access to the mummies at the British Museum. And from there, she created an installation based from that encounter, and she kind of used sand and brought all of this Peruvian objects back to the land it came from. And so it has that it has like a very conceptual approach, but it was also very poetic. And she kind of created a painting, as you can see in the picture right there. Those are the objects that she kind of returned to Peruvian sands. Again, these are just like activations in terms of talking about empire and how indigenous communities and groups were displaced and kind of left out in the conversation of how things should be. So I'm just going to be rolling some of the images that probably is interesting to look at. These artists are all climate change artists, or kind of have that angle in their practice. So for example, this one is Paul Coxsedge. He's another artist from, I think he's from Wales, so from the UK. And he's been creating all of these sculptures that imagines or visualizes how much coal we use when we turn on a light bulb. And so it's this types of artists that I'm really interested in, because they want to visualize human impact into nature, into the environment. But we also have to highlight the plight of indigenous communities. For example, for the Planet for Our Future exhibition, I work with the Caribbean Film Collective, to show one of their amazing video works, Mermaids or Iden in Wonderland. This was their work from 2013, and it's basically a video work that kind of like tells a story of Iden, who kind of like goes back to his like, I guess, community. So Iden was basically kidnapped by white folks in the film, and then he was kind of like returned back to the indigenous communities where he's from. But now he's readjusting to nature. He's like trying to find out how to survive in nature without all of this types of comforts that modernity offered. And so it's that kind of conversation, or it's that type of film that makes you think about, again, human technology and living with nature and caring for it. So there's like loads of other examples. For example, Aykroyd and Harvey kind of like going into that route of Joseph Beuys, another amazing artist from the 70s, who was actually the kind of founder of the Green Party in Germany. So he was an artist, and his proposal was to plant 7,000 oaks in Kassel, and loads of different artists across the world has been kind of inspired by that. And so there's a lot of tree planting types of initiatives that artists has been working on. And then we also have Paulo Nazareth, for example, in Brazil, who's been doing all of these amazing performances, talking about banana plantations, the conversion of the Amazon to all of this industrial banana complex. And again, not thinking about the repercussions of agricultural industry to displacements of indigenous communities, but also the disappearances of different kinds of species of animals in the Amazon. So in terms of equity and in terms of access to kind of like the programs that we have, so the museum has introduced pay if and what you can. So at the museum here, it's usually free for you to come and have a look around and join our programs. It's basically donation based, and we've been kind of like creating different learning materials. For example, we kind of provide advice in terms of creating a climate cafe, because of all of this climate crisis news, like for example in LA recently, the fires and everything. Now we have climate cafes for our communities to kind of come around, talk about their feelings about a changing climate, and have a support group to process that with them. And so we've been kind of also providing different ways for folks to kind of like be green. And these are like really easy things to do, like recycling and kind of like switching your journeys to bus trains or walking rather than driving. And because we can't recommend for you to kind of like, go and buy an EV vehicle, because again, that's like expensive, and obviously we don't want to be a conversation on who can afford to transition to green energy, right? But rather we want it to be more kind of a conversation on what already exists that we know is ecological and regenerative and doesn't pollute the planet. And I'm also kind of like a big fan of Shireen Sena, for example. She has like an amazing practice on the archive, and this particular piece, To Pick a Flower, it's her video work from 2021, and it basically looked at the botanical kind of collection of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and how all of this, American scientists, botanists went there to get all of this species of different flora and fauna. And it's such a great work, and it tells the story of climate change from a perspective of a tree. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't seen this video work, it's beautiful and it's amazing. So in terms of infrastructure, so again, we've noted earlier on, or probably now, no, I'm just introducing it now. But the idea of infrastructure is quite different from, like the global north and the global south, right? And if we're going to be very specific, global south in the Philippines, right? And so I think the infrastructure that I kind of like refer to is basically, the budget to kind of create exhibitions and programs that kind of talks about a discursive take on climate change, because it's the discursive that means it's often quite political, because you have to look at who caused climate change, and usually that is the global north. It's the industrialization, it's the atomic bomb, and it's all of the scientific innovations that led to a lot of nature loss and nature collapse, right? And so the problem with that is that most of the museums across the globe, or at least in America, in the United States, most of the museums are still quite heavily funded by fossil fuel money. And that is kind of like a challenge, right? In terms of like, how will you be true to yourself, or how do you become a genuine museum that actually talks about climate change if your funding is from oil money? And obviously there's a lot of case studies. The Tate, for example, in London, had that problem, but now they kind of like said they're not going to take money or oil money from BP, British Petroleum. And so it was done because activists were kind of like, kind of doing something about it. They were actively going to the Tate and protesting where their money is coming from, and it worked. And so I think when we talk about sort of like funding structures, it's quite different, right? Because in the Philippines, probably it's quite similar. Probably Shell will be sponsoring a show at the Ayala Museum. Not sure. Please don't quote me on that. But it's these types of things that we need to be aware of, and obviously we need to have ethics in terms of making sure that we do our kind of research and due diligence in looking at where that money came from. Is it actually, money from another fossil fuel company trying to greenwash? Another kind of like issue on infrastructure is kind of like, again, the museum kind of structure in the Philippines is quite different, because usually it's a national agenda that is kind of like part of the programming of the museum. And that usually becomes a challenge as well, because it's political in the Philippines. Like, for example, when you kind of like ask the question, who controls water in the Philippines, right? And again, you pinpoint those people, and when you try to create a show, an investigative show to talk about these things, then you might get red tagged, and that will affect the funding of a particular show. And so I think that's also kind of like an issue in terms of kind of creating a climate change exhibition, because we don't want it to be just like lip service, right? To kind of like show you all of this beautiful images of a climate change world. But what we want to actually do as like, serious climate change curators, like talk about the underlying issues about those things. How did that landscape change? There needs to be kind of like person or a company who did that. Why are the seas turning green and the algal bloom, for example, right? Because warming oceans, because of the warming ocean. And this is again related to all of this upheavals and crises that we're just beginning to understand now that we've caused it. So collaboration is key, because you get different expertise, for example. So I'm collaborating currently with the 𝘶𝘱𝘴 Institute in Rotterdam. So that's the Design and Architecture Museum of the Netherlands, and they have an amazing archive on green and sustainable architecture and design since the 1920s. And so I'm looking at all of those types of archival things and relating it to different types of indigenous thinking as well, in terms of not kind of heavily relying on technology, but rather relying on all of this kinds of things that we already know is, works for preserving our kind of environment. So what else is there to talk about? So the other thing is sustainability. And we all know that exhibitions are quite, it's not sustainable in terms of how we change shows every so often, right? So for the museum here, we kind of like changed the programming. So instead of 4 shows a year, now we're only doing 2. And that means we kind of like make those 2 shows very exciting. And so that means kind of like programming it to be cohesive but different stories. So it's like a museum landscape type of idea. We have one big question, and we have like probably 3 or 4 different exhibitions that talks about it. And with this type of kind of strategy, we lessen the building of new walls, repainting the galleries, and we've actually started kind of introducing. It's more expensive, obviously, but seeded papers as labels. So, for example, we've started doing that for Sediment Spirit, and the kind of label will be planted. We planted it after the exhibition run, and kind of created a flower garden outside of the museum when the exhibition was gone. And so it's that kind of just being agile and creative in terms of like how can we reduce the waste for our exhibition builds, but also we're trying to look at shipping, for example, because that's very carbon intensive as well. If we're shipping one work from the Philippines all the way to the UK, what is it the most efficient and ecological way of doing that? Is it flying it, or is it just shipping it through kind of a courier that will take 4 months via a shipping boat or something? So it's those types of things that is obviously kind of considered when we're planning a show. And because our shows are usually very international, it needs to kind of like, we need to get it from somewhere, and sometimes it's not in the UK. And yeah, when we need to do that, we have to kind of like look at the least polluting way of getting a particular artwork.
So that's the lecture by Ken Spanrado. We thank him for sharing with us the programming that he does for the center, which is a university museum. So it's very interesting to see examples of what university museum can do in terms of collaborating with other fields. A longer version of this lecture will be edited together with the documentation of this afternoon and will be uploaded at the Bulwagan and Dangal YouTube soon. So obviously, this topic is a very, there's a lot to unpack. So we would like to share the longer version with the rest of you soon. So now we move on to the roundtable discussion. So as I read the bios of the panelists, I invite you to please go on stage. I'll read all of the 3 bios, and then they'll be sharing some of their practices. So first is Ysai Rodriguez. Ysai's work centers on themes of humanism and ecology through archival research, community engagements, and interdisciplinary collaborations. She explores that articulation of thoughts, emotions, and values through art and technology. She's an interdisciplinary artist, active member and trustee for both the Philippine Botanical Art Society and Philippine Native Plants Conservation Society, Inc. She serves as the assistant director for the Healing and Regenerative Arts of at Macarena Foundation, and lectures at the UP College of Fine Arts here in Diliman. CM Dairit is our interdisciplinary artist whose work investigates notions of space, power, and identity as they are represented and reproduced in monuments, museums, maps, and other institutionalized media. Working with textile installations, archival interventions, and community-based workshops, Derek's work responds to different marginalized communities, encouraging a critical reflection on colonial and privileged perspectives. While informed by the experiences of colonialism from the perspective of the Philippines, his work nonetheless defies being tied to a specific position or location. Instead, his work and research cross over geopolitical and supernatural beings. And our last panelist is David Locran. Davis is an art curator and co-founder of Emerging Islands, a coastal art residency in La Union, Philippines, working to create interdisciplinary stories of ecology and the archipelago, rooted in community experience. His work as a curator is process-focused, working primarily with artists during the creation phase to help them understand the personal motivations behind their material and conceptual frameworks. His curatorial pursuits intersect queerness, spirituality, and ecology. So let's all welcome our three panelists.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mr. Rodriguez, and thank you, Con, for giving the three of us a good introduction. So, I guess I have some notes. So, I'd like to introduce myself mainly as an artist, pollinator, and lifelong learner, more simply put. So that's the reason why I also do research on this, but it's actually an anchor to my practice. So a lot of times I disappear in the process and just participate in drawing out, I guess, the best from the students or the communities we work with. So one has also mentioned that I also work with organizations that mainly sorry, do with plants, and I also function as the assistant director for healing and regenerative arts in a Kalahok based farm where we operate. One of our projects there involves working with communities to transition from conventional farming to make more regenerative approach. So this is just a simple PowerPoint slide I shared with Con before. So these images are a bit random, and I hope I'm able to explain more deeper later if you ask questions. My participation here also in the university, I function as an instructor for NSTP, so Civic and Welfare Training Services for UPCFA Open Arts School. So one of our recent projects was Work Tree Walks. So last year we designed with our students Rainbow Tree Walk. So we're thinking about how to advocate for knowing more about our native species here in the campus as a green campus. So we work with Philippine Native Plants Conservation Society to design a tree walk wherein at least children could remember 7 native species inside the campus. So we work with Sir Ronald, who's also an artist. And then one of our recent projects here, if you walk around the oval, you'll find some plates along the trees. So we've recently launched a web prototype wherein we encourage users who are always on their phones to walk with nature. So we work with UP Junior Music Educators Guild to plug in different kinds of music in different geofences along the oval. So this enhances their walking or running or jogging experience along the oval. So I guess I'll end it there. Okay. So there's also this project we recently presented in Gravity Art Space. So we the 𝘱𝘍𝘍𝘵 team and 𝘱𝑃𝑔𝑚𝑒NT2PIXEL projects were presented there. So we have this ongoing effort also of like creating virtual assets for urban design. So I'm not sure for practicing landscape artists, but not a lot of our native trees are represented in like design, architectural design program. So we wanted to create a library that represents our own trees, and I think it's a long way to go, but I hope that this can facilitate like designing our cities more closer to our own assets. So these are some notes that we have shared in our interdisciplinary process in developing our web app for 𝘍𝘍𝘵. So 𝘍𝘍𝘵 is like drawing with sound. So if you like to learn more about the work, it's better to experience when you go out to the valley.
Hello. Okay. I am Sian. Thanks for having me. OICA, Bulwagan naman. Thanks Con for inviting me. I'm gonna try to spend the next few minutes, hopefully not too long, responding to the theme, artistic responses to sustainability, by focusing on the idea of Manila Bay and the bay in general. So what is a bay? Bay is, well, as you can see, and as we know, it's a body of water that's surrounded by land, but also open to the ocean. Its geography, its geology, and its formation protects. It's basically like its natural barrier for strong winds and waves, and it's usually it usually houses, or like you can find in it estuaries or mouths of rivers, and it has a significant connection to the history of human settlements and the development of sea and global trade, and in a way it basically has severe impacts in the formation of nations and states and civilization as we know it. And these are different maps from Manila Bay, which you can see throughout history, but at the same time, next slide please. The Manila Bay, as you can see here, different images, has and forever will be sites of events that shape our nation politically, economically, and culturally. Manila Bay has long been a muse to Philippine arts, with iconic bay walk captured in paintings, postcards, stamps, cinema, song, and novel. And it has become an archetype to Manila and the Philippines in all its splendor and wrath. Both the representation of the bay and the bay itself, as you can see here, are being sold at markets. And as Marxverse, translating nature and labor into value is central to capitalism. So next slide, please. And for centuries, we know and we see and we recognize and acknowledge that Manila Bay has been a site for speculation, from invasion to investment. But what is the difference between invasion and investment? Different regimes plaster their branding on the decaying backdrop of this geological formation. Policy has protected the bay and its resources and the people relying on it, but at the same time, policy has also allowed the destruction of the natural environment and displacement of communities, giving way to new development of the built environment in favor of super profits and corporate interests. Next slide, please. So this slide is from Philippine Reclamation Authority from 2021. There has been updates since then. But as you can see here, there are different public-private partnerships for aggressive infrastructure projects, commercial and cultural complexes for better or for worse for what it's worth, transnational hotel and casino to lure foreign investments. There are, at the moment, about 22 reclamation projects. Some of them taking out mangroves and making new mangroves at the same time, while playing God to justify super profits. So when we talk about sustainability, what are we trying to sustain really? Are we trying to sustain resources? Are we trying to sustain profits or the capacity to gain profits? Are we trying to sustain value or are we trying to sustain meanings? Next slide, please. As we can see here, so this is a drawing by mussel farmer and fisher folk in Cavite, done in a workshop 2 years ago. In one of my field visits in the area. So the drawing shows at the center a dredging boat which has been replacing small boats of fisher folk. The drawing also shows different development projects and infrastructure projects displacing communities that have been there and have been relying on the bay for livelihood for generations. And on the other side of this slide is a leaflet that was being distributed. The image is not so clear, but then it's from local government and San Miguel Corporation announcing further land reclamation projects. So if you know San Miguel Corporation's large conglomerate owned by Ramon Ang and company, so among one of his many projects is Bulwagan Aerotropolis. They're building new airports and taking out mangroves, taking out communities, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay. So a lot of my work are sort of influenced and inspired and prompted by the different workshops that I've given to different communities, mostly peasant and indigenous and fisher folk and urban poor. We're in these workshops offer time and space for different participants to make maps, particularly counter maps, wherein we talk about spaces in terms of their own experience to militarization and displacement and rights violations, and these become springboards to the work I do in the studio. So at the same time, this practice is an expansion to my studio practice. So there are different effects of land reclamation to community and environment. Next slide, please. And I guess talking about making landscapes and the idea of horizon and past and future, like I would like to stress the idea of looking into all these different contested narratives. And when we draw the horizon line, and we try to make a landscape that features different human intervention, good or bad, to the environment, what does this horizon line mean in comparison to the mass line? Next slide, please. Here are some sample photographs. I'll just run through them of work in relation to the topic of artistic responses to sustainability, which we can perhaps discuss later on. Next slide. And then that's pretty much it for the intro.
Let's skip to the next slide. I just want to caveat all of this by saying that I am a curator, but I'm a self-trained curator. I started doing all of this by working in galleries and instigating art projects with artists. Basically learned to do what I do now, just working with artists and maybe spending too much time hanging out with them. But my curatorial practice really started when I co-opened or co-founded a space called 𝘮𝘮𝘏, which is an art space with a little bar that was only open at night and was tucked in a dark street corner in the red light district of Makati. Next slide, please. It was a space for many artists, a lot of young artists who were keen to explore new methods and processes and really experiment. And what's really one really specific memory I have from 𝘮𝘮𝘏, because it's closed now, was that I would see all these people of a particular generation hanging out at 𝘮𝘮𝘏 or exhibiting at 𝘮𝘮𝘏, all displaying climate anxiety. So it was my first experience seeing climate anxiety in other people, and especially artists. And that kind of, next slide, it's a very kind of different experience to what I do now and where I live now. In 2020, when the pandemic happened and I was forced to close Limbo, I moved to San Juan in La Union, seeking refuge from, Manila and what Manila was like then. And I met these three lovely ladies, Hannah, Nicola, and Sam, and we co-founded Emerging Islands. Originally founded as an art residency, that has since evolved into a collective and active project space working around art, community, and ecology. So what we do is we kind of stage these encounters between and amongst different groups, artists, local communities, local government units, scientists, etc., and operationalize everyone into ecological storytelling. Next slide, please. So the output is kind of really different. We do things like presentations, the film you may have caught earlier, workshops, we even do raves and things. It's all a variety, but the goal is really simple. It's to engage everyone in ecology and community. Okay. And just some of the some examples of the work I've done as curator. This was a transmedia exhibit launched last October at the National Museum of Anthropology. It's called the Baylan of Mount Kalatuan. Baylan is the term in Bukidnon for what we here call babaylan. So it's shaman. Right? And it's transmedia in that it shows photos from 𝘮𝑉, as you can see. The next slide, please. Illustrations by ritualist and artist Alaga, illustrations of the pantheon of the Talaande community's mythologies, a painting by 𝘰𝘮𝑗𝑏𝘪𝑡𝑒 of the Talaande community's first ever babaylan. Next slide. Going back, sorry. And also, it was the launching platform for the film Baradia, that you saw the trailer of earlier. And it's many different things happening here, but the goal here of this project was very simple. It was to show that the Baylan, or the Babaylan, are very much alive. They're not a thing of the past, like many of us might imagine, as these old crones kind of, they exist for sure, but they exist in the youth of these communities as well. Next slide, please. We do other projects such as workshops. This was one called Wild Patch, a project instigated with artist Derek Dumala and curator Ligaya Salazar. And this project was around really exploring the ecological value of weeds, right? Because we have this idea of weeds being a problem, I think, to be rooted off the ground, right? But upon our immersion in the community, we learned that indigenous communities see weeds differently. They don't actually call them weeds that way, right? They're just plants. They're not things to be taken out of the garden. They're things that feed and play a very, very, very important role in the ecology. What we really wanted to do here was meet like Alola Basha, who could teach us, plants, right? We don't know the names of plants anymore. We wanted to learn from them, and so we did a foraging walk. And what's also interesting about the community that we work with here, called Barangay Opo Plus in Suliban, just the northernmost part of La Union, is that they're a community called Bago, which means new, right? And it's basically kind of a new social formation in which a barangay is formed by different, people and families from different indigenous communities from the Cordillera region. So that's the thing now. Okay, so that this was supposed to be, sorry, in the slide before, but that's Baradia. It's a film about a young transgender 𝘮𝘀𝘭𝘢𝘀 named Crystal, whose spiritual name is 𝘱𝘂. And when we worked with the community and we were kind of on the path to making a film, we asked them, what do you want to do with this film, right? What do you want to achieve? And their answer was, we want to pollinate the baylan. We want the baylan everywhere to emerge and to see themselves in us. This is a photo of 𝘮𝑡𝑢 Arayan. He is our kind of spiritual mentor, and is very young, at 30 years old, but happens to be the chief babaylan of all the Manobo tribes of Bukidnon. And he's musical director of Kulahi Pangatupan Performing Arts. So when we did that exhibit in the National Museum, we flew this entire group of 20 young individuals, some of the most talented, most spirited performers I've ever seen in my entire life. And what's great about them is you can see that they're all, mostly queer, young, obviously, and the things they perform are new creations. They're rooted in their myths, but they're new stories, they're new songs, new chants, new choreographies, new dances. And that shows that, things such as myth are not a thing of the past. They're a thing to be created again and again in the present. Next slide, please. We do like commercial gallery exhibits as well. This one is called The Heart of Every Mountain is Ocean. And it's a solo work by Irene Maurer-Bubuyag, who is a weaver from Kalinga. The title is this because this series of tapestries and weaves and embroideries, are inspired by her first ever encounter with ocean and seeing underwater. And the process for her was really interesting because she went underwater once in Palawan and had to go back up to Kalinga to produce the work, and memories of the water and the mountain would merge in her mind, giving us a picture of what the world is really like in the sense of deep time, in the sense that once upon a time our mountains were ocean, right? Irene's story is also really interesting because as a weaver and embroiderer rooted in traditional practice, she represents the self-determination of her community in diversifying the techniques of embroidery. As you can see, this is not traditional, right? Like what's traditional is often very symmetrical, very kind of organized and clean that way. But she and her community are changing all that and really kind of breaking down this kind of very problematic dichotomy between arts and crafts. Next slide, please. So just some insights on what I've experienced working with spirituality and indigenous communities is the idea of a sustainable ecology and wondering what that's like. We're always chasing after this idea, trying to protect something when really that already exists out there. Indigenous life is sustainable ecology. We have this idea that, of course, you have so much plight. They really do have so much plight, but they have so much abundance too, right? And that's hard to imagine probably without yourselves encountering indigenous communities. There's a need to perform culture, right? Because if you don't perform culture, the culture disappears or is sometimes replaced by something vile. And the need to produce heritage, right? Cultural heritage. Also want to underscore the importance of babaylan, which is, in my opinion, the fount of art and ecology. Like art and ecology live in the lives of the babaylan, and they bridge creativity and stewardship. Like the way, they are kind of living archives of knowledge are never separated from their, role as ecological stewards of the land. And fourthly, the importance of artistic co-creation with communities is that, what's really missing is visibility of the lives of indigenous communities, and there is a real need to kind of rebalance the landscape of, let's say, media, what it is we all see and what it is we all consume, because very little of that comes from local and indigenous communities. And, we get in there and co-create with the goal of emerging their stories primarily. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Isay, Ian, and David. So, of course, these are short introductions, and we can talk about the things that they have mentioned. And also including, because ideal scenario here is that we have Ken in a hybrid situation, but he's a very busy person. He's opening a show soon in UK. So, but we have a question that we asked him, and
you talked about more of the institutional standpoint and also operations of the institution in terms of how you keep this integrity. I'm just curious how personally you deal with navigating contradictions, especially that the museum is not a neutral space. Curatorial is selection, therefore exclusion. So how do you think of your position and your institution in trying to internally resolve those, or is that an ongoing thing that you always grapple with? I'm curious because, of course, we're talking to students and practitioners and artists who always the things that motivate us comes from very personal experiences and also inspiration or background. So I'm curious also on how, as a Filipino working in the West, it's also a contradiction. So yeah.
Yes, that's like a very kind of interesting question, Con. Thank you for that question. So I think in terms of grappling the kind of complexity of all of these things, because there's always that contradiction, as you put it, right? In terms of when we create something, we obviously need to get the materials for creating that something from nature, right? And so what we kind of, in terms of that sustainability angle, what I'm grappling with is always the kind of upcycling of things, and that's why I think collaboration is key. The more creative people you surround yourself with, the more you could kind of think of innovative ways of kind of doing things regeneratively or sustainably. So one particular example is basically we had to kind of get big boulders. So kind of we had an installation, and the artist 𝘱𝘐𝑻𝑒𝑡𝑒𝑟 there. It's a piece called 𝘮𝑚𝑎𝑙𝑒S Ancestrales. It's a piece from 2013. It's basically a video work installation talking about the indigenous wisdom from Senegal in Dakar. And so in that video, it required 9 boulders. And so imagine I had to think in terms of are we going to be blasting a mountain somewhere to just get all of these boulders to create this installation? Obviously, the answer was no. And so I had to be creative in terms of okay, if we can't get all of these boulders, how do we kind of create it visually with basically just it's just the outside that we need to make it look real. It doesn't need to weigh 50 kilos each. And so what we did was to kind of contact a garden place that produces ecological rocks, and because they're made out of recycled kinds of plastic, and they kind of turn it into sort of own figure. And so I went to their workshop and, basically did my kind of research, due diligence, kind of checking, oh, really, is this like, kind of just like checking what the promises are or what's in the tin in terms of their product. And it checked out. It was like, oh, it's so innovative when you kind of like, again, think of alternatives. And so to cut the story short, we got like the boulders, and we kind of like created a deal as well to kind of like say that we're only loaning it, we're not buying it. So that the whole thing is basically we're using it for an installation, and then we're returning it back to them after the exhibition run. And so it's also developing a kind of partnership with people who's doing active kind of innovation in the realms of sustainability. And that's how I grapple it. It's one of the examples, right? And again, it's the complexity of each project. Each kind of exhibition will have its unique kind of curatorial questions, and it's, again, you just do it when it's there, and basically trying to solve it with others, and I believe in collaboration, and that's, I think, how I will answer that question, Con, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so with Ken's answer, no, so I would also like to encourage anyone who has a question or an insight, just please get behind the mic so we can acknowledge you at any point of the conversation. So you are part of the round table. So maybe to start off, I've noticed in this discussion that we are sharing even with Ken, we are going back and forth with centering and decentering the art object. Because artistic responses, now you would expect an object to be the immediate response, but also this, we are talking about environmental sustainability, so regenerative, and even in the sharings, film as a form, sound as a form, but then we also have like the boulder and Cian's work, so that we are still in this the freedom to go back and forth to the object. So I am just curious because I want to hear also from Isay. Before she was part of all these efforts, she also was producing objects. Maybe you want to talk about that journey of when and how did you realize that the invisibility or intangibility of the art object is a way to go in terms of your practice.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I used to be also like an artist. I'm a painting major, and I guess most of my peers know me as the unprolific painter because I guess some people think that I stopped making objects, but it doesn't mean that I stopped doing creative work. But I guess parang yung the artist's role, sometimes ikaw yung glue sa gitna ng mga bagay na pinagsasama mo, and you don't always have to be there. Or, disappearing in the process and letting people find or draw it out from them kung ano yung values that you want to be drawn out. For example, in my work sa school tsaka sa foundation, it's always about helping people remember about the interconnectedness of things. Kasi parang when we think about climate change, it's not really about parang what kind of emotions do we want to feel and how are we going to parang achieve yung steps towards parang solving that. But it's not always like one person. It's like integrative in a way. So I feel like in my day job, I found the word to call my art practices like integrative arts. So parang it doesn't always have to be a new platform outside the box. It's within, parang working dun sa borders ng box. Parang ano na ba yung possible? Ano ba yung pwedeng magawa already with that? And then it doesn't always have to be, it doesn't always have to yield an object or a physical object. Tapos kahit yung recent project namin, how can we do tech without sensors or tech itself na parang what do we already have with us? Parang yung ubiquity ng tools. For example, when you walk. So we don't need to download yung app, or you don't have to. But what you already have, so we made use of geofences to put the content there. And I feel like it starts out with the listening or music project, but it can also yield like other practical uses in the field where we work. So I feel like art is only like touching the iceberg of possibilities.
Right, especially you work with technology as well. No? Yung kasi this project mo, she also had this AR output and so visa. Can you talk about more than that?
Okay, so parang before nagkaroon ko ng opportunity to parang to present or to translate yung experience of foraging in the forest through AR and VR, pero parang as time went by, parang with like when you rethink some projects, parang sometimes yung tech gets in the way of what your intention is. So parang it's always refining the idea and getting closer to the intention. So parang maybe it's something that you don't need to see, something that it doesn't need to be a physical object, but parang how do you represent those invisible things, yung interstices of the process. Or for example, even sometimes nag-disappear na rin yung pagiging artist when you think about the logistics part of doing the work, looking at the receipts, yung liquidation part of the project na parang it's also like a critical way of looking back into the project na if I conduct this project sustainably, saan ba napunta yung kaban? Napunta ba siya sa parang actual objects? Napunta ba siya sa mga tao? Yeah, so those things na parang I constantly think about as an artist na who also disappears in the process.
Right, no, that's very interesting to hear coming from Isa. The technology gets in the way sometimes and all of these things. So sometimes you are really compelled to decenter the self or the artist. So maybe because David already sort of talked about that initial, when did you realize that there is something about artists talking about climate? Siguro Cian also, can you share how did you stumble upon this thematic of your...
Hello. Okay. I don't think I explicitly think about or respond to the idea of climate or ecology, but in a way it naturally just comes up because it intersects with all the other stuff I'm talking about anyway, land, food, rights, social justice within the work. But in the case of like climate and ecology, and in relation to my intro on Manila Bay, I guess like there was this one painting I showed kanina. It was a painting, a triptych. It was just for any other small commercial gallery exhibition that just happened to be in a mall that was in Manila Bay area, reclaimed land. So I was, for this no theme show, I was responding to land reclamation, which I knew nothing about, but I had leads to who to ask. So I approached Pamalakaya Federation of Small Fisher Folk, and I had them give me a briefer on what reclamation issue was, and in a way got me immersed within this whole discourse and this whole issue. So I guess central in aligning the artistic project or the practice into existing campaigns of social movements. And then the idea of making an object out of it is just part and parcel, or like this production of material artifact is like, I always just think that it's a byproduct of the research and the conversations that you have with different communities and groups. So yeah, so it was
you sort of answered naman now that the route that you took is not really into like climate, but all those intertwining politics.
Yeah, so there never really was a prompt na parang like, oh, I'm gonna talk about climate this time around. So it's always kind of like, they're going with all the other stuff.
which is also very natural for artists in the Philippines because this is our environment and our context. No? So, categorization is something that we always fight with, but also we welcome sometimes. No? Syempre, the museum workers here very much into categorization of things and artists. Talking about the relationship between politics and human rights, I want to ask David, when you transplanted yourself from the city to La Union, what kind of issues did you encounter that are very present in the community and really compelled you that, yeah, this is something that we should address something?
Well, for anyone who hasn't been to La Union yet, right, this is a long kind of vertical stretch where life is between the mountain and the sea. And much of our work is really around coastal communities, or like a large, majority of projects we've done in La Union are with coastal communities. And it's really, it's really problematic. I mean, at some point in, I think, the 60s or 70s, a lot of black sand mining was done to mine for, I think, magnetite or something. And these are really like changing landscapes, right? Like, and these have been changing since then up to now, especially the introduction of tourism, right? That happened, or that really kind of blew up when it became surf town. Before it was a nice beach town. One part of it was like the Boracay of the north, right? And it's all this human activity that's really altering kind of the environment themselves, right? Like the building of seawalls that have, nothing to do with consultation with, environmental groups or what have you. That are really like affecting coastal communities. Like we've worked with some communities who had to move their house like several times in one generation, right? Just to kind of to move away from the rising tide, right? But it's not all bad, right? There's a lot of really, really good work being done in coastal communities there, especially with the foundation of marine protected areas. So there is that, right? So it's both grief and hope. It's always a balancing act that way. And so when we get to work there, we just want artists to see that actual reality, right? That there's so much loss, but there's also really good work being done by the communities themselves.
I also think that it's so nice that Ken differentiated climate change and human-made climate change, and that is an example of what human-made climate change is. We can blame the global north, pwede naman yun talaga, yung trash nila and all this, we can definitely blame them, but also in our local context, there are a lot of like these things that are happening in our very small towns or communities. We can also try to not really address because that's a collective effort, but talk about, ask for questions. So, speaking of questions, guys, you are welcome to just stand behind the microphone and ask any of our panelists. I have a long list of questions we can talk about. Dito naman, no? But yes, go James.
Hi everyone. I think very interesting mix of panelists you have. But my question is for Isai. I think your 𝘮𝘧𝘴 project is very interesting. It actually reminds me of another previous project, but where it talks about sonicscape in around the campus. I wonder if you have collected sound data through your project, and then what are you going to do with the data, sound data, and are there any discoveries or interesting discoveries about the the data that you collected that reveals something about the very specific community of, the UP community. So, yeah.
Thank you. So just to be clear, it's a collective project. So it's also like proposing a kind of format of working collectively with others. So parang we also like unpack on how we work interdisciplinarily. So parang there's the three of us mainly. So one of them is Pat Canandas is from UP JMIG, UP Junior Music Educators Guild. And then there's Jerome Suplemento from UP-OU, so he's part of the tech part. And then in my case, parang I somehow organized the opportunity to do this project with an organizational partner to rethink our existence in the campus, kasi being campus. So parang actually, nasa process kami in different phases pa of developing the web application. But the goal is to actually reach the point that we could share it with other people, where we could co-create with them with their own devices. But at this point, we're featuring like different sound compositions by different students from the College of Music. We harvested field notes from the lagoon. So the idea is to hear the sounds of yung wildlife beneath the trees, na meron pa yung UP, and then bringing it out dun sa oval when you walk through the yung access points na ginawa namin dun sa oval. So, nandun pa kami sa process of, like, it's an ongoing process of understanding what we heard then. And as of now, parang, yeah, it's like abstract art. Na parang it's just as ano ba? Parang your own interpretation of the landscape. So eventually we want it to be like something that it's like using a turntable, using the oval as a turntable, and with your movement, parang yung data trackers can like recompose the sounds that you recorded or inputted. So it's more of like an exploratory project to deal with technology. I don't know if
Thank you, Isay. I also appreciate that it's a long-term project. Of course, dahil na Arts Month, we are very used to the demand of having this instant projects that every February we have to come up with all these things that kaya tayo nag-end up with object-based. So because of that demand. And sometimes these kinds of projects that do not really have an instant result are more interesting. We are more invested in them, and that we have space for thinking and also expanding the ideas that we are trying to unpack. So thank you for that. Speaking of collaborations also, I'm sure we have an idea of what collaboration is coming from what we have experienced before. But I want to ask the three of you, how has collaboration or the meaning of collaboration changed as you went through collaborating with communities, like IT communities or communities in La Union, how they change these ideas, and how do you then now apply those learning or unlearning in your own independent practices?
I guess parang every project is a constant negotiation with each other. So parang arriving at a clear designation of what can be done or what else you can offer to dun sa larger picture you're trying to create. Also maybe like giving way or letting go of your original vision kasi you integrate now with the larger vision. It doesn't, sometimes you disappear.
Parang none of the stories that my work parang extends into, or parang none of the stories that I tell through my work are mine anyway. or ever really mind. So parang if anything, like the studio practice, the individual studio practice becomes a way to somehow amplify the stories that are coursed through me via the community and the collaborators as well. So parang if anything, parang collaboration has enriched the practice, but at the same time, it is also a question of labor, it is a question of authorship, and how do we make new forms of cultural production by constantly renegotiating authorship and distribution of resources in a way. So like I have a lot of work that deal with textile, I work with one particular embroiderer, and how do I compensate this work, and how do I sort of ground everything in terms of value, and how it like moves from one different like platform or institution to the other, from commercial gallery to museum to back into community to the streets and back into gallery and back into museum. So it's not ever just about like me in the studio making things, but then how I like maintain this growing network of collaborators, be it in the form of research assistants or contributors within or different scholars that I reference within the objects that we make. So then, yeah.
I think before working with, indigenous communities or local communities, my kind of image of collaboration was literally like two artists kind of, joining hands and kind of making the work together, which is true, which happens in the context that we operate in. But it's kind of shifted into more of a sense of like coexistence, right? And what kind of again, visibility do we have, right, versus them, right? And so in the space of collaboration, factoring in all, the factors of like agency, for example, what it's come up to is really, emerging their story and kind of just coming in there and helping. It's really just like helping provide what they don't have, right? Like if an indigenous community wanted to share their story, how would they get here, right? They would have to be invited, right? If they wanted to tell their story through a film, how would they do it if they don't have access to media and technology, right? So it's really just, giving that, right? And the rest is their story. And that becomes, in our minds, a rebalancing of that injustice.
Exactly, so collaboration really is a foregrounding of equity, that everyone is provided a space, an equitable space, that you are co-creators and co-authors in this work that you are trying to do. So it's also interesting, sometimes it collapses, magiging flat yan pagdating sa art world when it is presented. And the process flattens, nagiging isa na lang yung pangalan. So that kind of contradiction sometimes is counterproductive to an equitable artistic response that actually foregrounds sustainability. Any questions, guys? Or instance? Yes,
Hi, Con. I know that you have a long list of questions, but can you indulge me? I rarely ask questions anyway. The first one, siguro, I wanted to, since I'm pretty familiar with the practice of CN, I kind of wanted to know the process of, it's so cool, the process of going to the communities, I think in this case specifically the Talakayan or the 𝘱𝘭𝘠 communities. I wanted to know what happened after. More specifically, was there an intention to, with a work to kind of empower or to activate or to organize them? I guess you can speak a little bit more about that as opposed to just saying it's just a springboard to the work that you do in the studio.
For sure, yeah. Actually, I wanted to follow up with Con's previous comment, and I'm trying to tease out this idea wherein the viewer or the audience or the reader or basically people who are viewing and experiencing the work could also be collaborators in a way, like participant collaborator in such a way that when they sort of experience and view the work, they also kind of like extend that story to the next person. May or may not reference the work itself, but at the same time, not too kind of centered on the object, but rather centered on the narrative. Parang like it kumakalat siya and becomes part of this larger genealogy of this storytelling practice. But in response to like yung Pamalakaya in particular. So that's how it started. It was prompted by a show in a commercial gallery, and then I asked questions to myself, and then I extended the questions to Pamalakaya, which has always been, I guess, part of my practice to initially, primarily, parang look into the perspective of people's organizations, because the work is always aligned with these campaigns for social justice and human rights and land. So always parang foregrounding. So Pamalakaya, what's up with Manila Bay, ganyan. And they were like, oh, so that was my first time meeting up with Pamalakaya, not even as a SACA member. I think at the time SACA did not exist yet. Yeah, parang ganun. So like I was a CN, visual artist, and they were like, oh, may artist dito nag-interview para sa isang painting. Tapos parang like, what does that even mean, right? So I went there to Cubao, the office there, and then like I was asking, they gave me a primer, and then after, okay, I'll make a work about it, and then we'll see what I can do in terms of like if you have folietos that I can incorporate into the work. So it started as that. Like a lot of the work that I do kind of attempts to be like a platform for these organizations that I reference and work with anyway. But having been an object that participates within art market, it is bound to either go back to your studio or go to a collector. And parang yun nga, parang it's also kind of like a tricky question. Like once it becomes money, parang like where does the money go? So interesting, no? Parang like you can always just give money back to the organization, sila na bahala to use it within their campaigns. But at the same time, you can think about the afterlife of this object, its documentation, my use of it in this presentation, to talk about Manila Bay. That's also an extension of it. I did not volunteer as a member of Pamalakaya, but I have a significant amount of work that is talking about the issue of fisher folk, and I have returned to community to do workshops, which then become more objects, which then somehow translate into different quantifiable and unquantifiable kind of outputs. So I guess it's like an open-ended answer in terms of what I can do, but I think it's always just having kind of like if an artist has a reference image, like my reference image is parang like the updated campaign of the People's Organization, and I try to make objects out of it, but then the objects out of it are just like part of the larger practice of just spreading stories anyway. And I kind of like it then. Parang I kind of like putting these in contested platforms such as galleries and the art market, which makes a lot of collectors and curators and galleries uncomfortable. And then sometimes they buy the work, and sometimes it's really contradictory. Why do you buy this work? Diba? Tapos parang, yun nga, like one of the works there is made for a fair, and then a fair in Basel. It's an 8-meter long tapestry, and then a Pinoy collector bought it. We met the collector because he's now the CFO of Bulwagan Airport. So parang that's so parang like yun din eh. Parang that's why I showed that work, and I kind of wanted to talk about that little anecdote. But at the same time, parang okay, what is this strategic position that we are finding ourselves in as contemporary artists, trying to foreground perspectives and campaigns of people's organizations. Yeah, marami pa actually.
Salamat Sian. Well, first of all, thank you also for the panel. No? I found the presentations really interesting. And I was wondering, since, I suppose this is for all three, even if you want to answer. I was also looking at how, the image itself of the environment, the landscape, plants, environment, plants, mountains, whatnot. I think these are very potent, productive when talking about environmental sustainability. But I'm kind of wondering if there are other routes to take. David already kind of hinted at, looking at the indigenous, looking at the Babaylan, the myth, which I think gives us another entry point to it. No? But I'm wondering if Isai, Sian, or maybe David, if you want to add anything else, if you can kind of hint or maybe explore in the future other ideas of looking at it aside from the I don't want to say obvious, no, pero the most the immediate response to environmental sustainability. Did that make sense?
I'm just gonna maybe give a short answer. I don't know if there are other strategic sites or other strategic routes. To me, the point is the mountain, is the forest, is the sea. That is the point. That is the thing that we have to contend with, right? That is the thing that is in peril. I think the larger question is how to get all these artists working around that, right? Because there's so much distance there, right? But that's not also true for all kinds of artists. That's maybe more true for artists living in the metropolis, right? So, I think what happened during the pandemic, the pandemic was a good thing in that a lot of residencies kind of popped up all over the Philippines. Like we were not the only one. We're certainly not the only one working with ecology, I think. And what this allowed was simply encounters, like people, being, taken out of their very lonely studios and seeing nature for the first time and realizing, oh, I'm nature too, And I think strategically, I guess, we can all operate to think of more ways by which artists can get out of where they are now and out there. It's that quite simply, I think.
Okay, so perhaps we shouldn't be looking at parang routes or particular methods, but instead like where these, or like it should be kind of bigger than that in a sense of like whatever we're doing, we can be doing to respond to all these large existential issues from wherever we are, but kind of shifting different gazes and lenses of how we view like climate, for example, and understanding that it is interconnected with gender, race, class, all these different kind of factors that affect everything else. Pero yun parang like as long as we're not recognizing that it is, say for example, the military-industrial complex, the food systems, parang all these larger, more systemic things that are affecting sustainability and ecology. Parang yun din naman like having the capacity to parang sort of focus and zero in, but at the same time, the capacity to take a step back and look at the broader picture of what we're trying to discuss or tackle anyway. Don't know yet. I mean, these are what these forums are for, but instead of, and beyond discourse and discussion, we can find ways on how these can translate into direct action in more ways than one, online, offline, face-to-face. So,
siguro yung take ko lang, you were saying na think of ways na routes that are not obvious. But I guess baka magandang tingnan kung ano yung obvious or yung pinakamalapit sa atin. Kasi doon siguro manggagaling yung kailangan ng transformation. I guess hindi kailangan laging grand or malayo or malaki. Kailangan mag-start sa bakuran.
I'd like to answer also. I think it's a curatorial question too, because these things are present already in the artist's work. It's just not presented that way. They are not presented as works about climate change or ecological or environmental, but they are very present kasi yung context naman natin. For example, last Saturday I moderated for the film 𝘮𝘀 by J. Pasena. And for me, that's a very environmental film because the site is Talakayan, which was tsunami affected in 2011. It is very, just recent studies in Japan says that is an effect of climate change. Anong una kasi deny nila because we are used to having tsunamis. So I think the artistic responses that we are looking for are also curatorial responses. That when we ask these questions and when we answers this query about ecology, we get we present all the answers that are already present. Kasi nga dapat regenerative, dapat we recycle works, we reshow them. So it's also a strategical, curatorial strategy to find those routes because curatorial is more a platform for questions that is actually parang less in terms of resources because you're asking questions. So I'm not sure if I'm answering, but for me, yun yung it maybe is a curatorial question. So yeah. Any more? Yes.
Hello, I love what you said. Thank you by the way for the wonderful sharing of your work. I like what you said po, that you're looking for what's already present. I think na-mention din po kanina sa lecture, sa earlier lecture na I think it was already mentioned in the lecture earlier that we need to look at what we're already doing that's already sustainable because not everyone can transfer to more sustainable methods like electric cars or whatnot. I love also that your work is highly collaborative and community-based. I just wonder, have you observed in the communities that you worked with your workshops, and have you observed any of their practices that are already sustainable and that is that are like unique to the Philippines? Are there any examples, or maybe that's like a bit of a difficult question?
No, I mean, a lot of indigenous life, again, is really sustainable. One example is agroecology, like how food is grown, right? How food is grown naturally, is more sustainable than monocropping. In a very export-based kind of economy where lands are raised to become monocrop farms, and those places are destroyed in the process, right? On the other hand, there's agroecology, where things just kind of grow naturally, right? That is sustainable because that's how it was before the colonizers came.
We're all responsible. I think everything that we're up against is everything that is not sustainable. Yeah, I mean agro-business plantation or large-scale industrial mining or the conventional farming methods or parang building more highways as opposed to making railways to give way for surplus automobiles, and now parang walang coding for electric cars because copper and nickel and zinc are coming from the Philippines anyway. So parang it must be related to some sort of policy wherein local bureaucrat capitalists benefit anyway as part of the Philippines is parang an integral part of the global supply chain, diba? So a lot of the resources that is feeding into this large machine is coming from our lands. A lot of the minerals are coming from us. So everything that we're up against is everything that's not sustainable. Yeah. So everything that is sustainable, they deem as dangerous and terrorists, diba? So parang sobrang sakto, agroecology, diba? Small farmers are forced to use synthetic pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides because they have to compete in mercado. They have to make money out of what they do, and in turn, they are also forced to participate in this vicious cycle of the market, and then are unable, or it makes it very difficult for them to produce food that are organic and healthy. So it also very much affects food security and food sovereignty in our islands, which is also a big contradiction because as we are large rice producers, we are also the largest rice importers. So a lot of these different contradictions within the economy is reproduced within contradictions of our culture and politics. Yeah. Sorry.
Maybe I'd like to add to that. Maybe parang gusto kong siguro mag-focus dun sa small attitudinal shifts. Kasi parang in the foundation where I work with, parang it's parang malaking bagay yung community-based education with farmers who wish to transition from conventional farming to like regenerative or natural to organic farming. Kasi yung sinasabi nila about food sovereignty, na nag-start siya dun sa hindi nila alam na yung kind ng seed na tinatanim nila kailangan open pollinated para hindi sila dependent sa mga pataba sa lupa, sa mga abono sa lupa. So parang yung mga maliliit na bagay na pwede kayong mag-art together, matutunan yung konsepto ng open pollinated varieties. Yung matuto sila ng DIY soil testing para walang makapagsabi sa kanila na bawal nyo itanim yan, hindi tutubo yan dyan. So parang, I guess yung art pwede siyang mag-integrate yung sarili niya sa small moments of learning about our land para makakain din sila. Tsaka, syempre, yung farmers, sila rin yung reason kung bakit tayo makakain lahat. So, yun.
Hello, magandang hapon. Ako si Lanis, isang architect at artist. Every year, it's easy to succumb to the idea of doomsday and the panic of it. Climate anxiety, like David said. But historically, we've gone through cycles of different kinds of doomsdays. We feel like every year is worse, but there are also very, very bad times from the past. So perhaps it's more cyclical than linear, this idea of the end, ecologically and everything beyond. So my simple question for all of you is, how do you maintain hope in your respective worlds? And any tips for an artist who panics every now and then? Thank you.
I feel like by nature, it's also how I am as a person. Pero parang whenever I know that I can do something to cope, pag may magagawa ako, parang I feel more relieved. So parang, or na if there's someone na, if there are people who can surround me na pwedeng kaming makinig sa isa't isa. I guess yung gesture of opening up like places where you can safely listen to each other and think about ways, even the smallest things na pwede nyo gawin together. I guess malaking bagay siya for as an artist.
Parang yung doomsday, parang for me is a very class thing. Parang like different classes understand the end of the world in different ways. Parang like kung COVID ka tapos wala kang trabaho, parang shit. Whereas kung parang you're comfortable in your Di ba? Pero yun nga, pero if you're well off, you have stocks, you have money constantly coming in, like you have a totally different worldview. So I think parang to look at it in a class lens also kind of paints you a different picture on where you should kind of be at in terms of finding community, forming different networks of solidarity and mutual aid. And parang yun nga, like where can you contribute and where can you participate? Kasi yun din yun eh, parang even if you are well off, pero you're seeing, parang it's a distasteful thing to see wherein you're parang safety, parang snug in your village, but in the village, parang people are not alright. So parang I guess it also is that consciousness that will kind of lead you to where you want to take this anxiety, because we can all take it together and better.
I think what's helped me, because I'm a very anxious person as well, and my life in Manila was very different. I responded to my anxieties very differently, and I think what helped is being able to see simultaneously grief and hope together in the same person, in the same image, at the same time, right? And for example, again, with let's say the Talakayan community that we worked with for that film, this is Bukidnon, right? This is the food basket of the Philippines, a plantation, entire forests kind of stripped, right? But at the same time, the community that we work with, they're so wonderful and exuberant, right? And every day they have to work hard as forest rangers to secure the very little of primary forest that's left in their mountains, right? And they do it all the time, whilst kind of suffering from development aggression, right? And to just see that helps so much, right? And to just see that, oh my God, I can be that too, because I think much of our life as Filipinos really exists between grief and hope. Our colonial kind of past will never leave us, right? But the future is still there.
Naging hopeful ka man. But this is a very hard naman talaga situation. But what we can do is float in. But that's right. Just find your people or find. What I like about activism in the Philippines, the activist groups are always there. If you are feeling anxious, and then you can isolate where that anxiety is coming from. There is always an organization that you can just visit, join, or just learn from, because the history of activism is so much. It has expanded so much that it is very natural for us to have those kinds of organizations. So yeah, just involve yourself, be in a collective, be in a community, and that will not erase this problems, but in our very small ways can try to find answers to questions. So siguro we go to last two questions from the audience.
Hi, Jose. I just have I hope it's not too general of a question, but I guess as artists dealing with sustainability and trying to find solutions to deal with the climate crisis, is there a way you kind of quantify just to see that the work that you're doing is actually making progressive impact? I know that might be a loaded question, but it's just I think I'm seeing you guys already doing that too, but it's is there a way or a metric that that the things that you are doing is definitely pushing you towards that regenerated future? Because the issue is very it's experiential and it's happening. And I don't know if we're running out of time, and I guess so those are kind of the general question for that.
I guess the question is about impact, right? In our realm, it's actually quite hard to paint a picture of impact, right? When we apply for grants, sometimes there's a field there. How are you ensuring impact? How are you measuring impact? How are you ensuring impact? And in the realm of stories, that's very, very hard to quantify. And sometimes it's only us, people who are doing that work, who see that themselves. And sometimes it's hard to translate it to the people funding the project or what have you. But we see it. We see people kind of rising up, people finding the energy to do their own storytelling, right? Even if we're not involved in it anymore, that is impactful, right? It's just more people kind of activating in the sense that we operate in, which is generally kind of like a network or a mycelium, kind of just like infecting each other with ideology. When you see those networks kind of just activating, that's enough impact to me.
Quantify is a hard word. Parang like, you make an art object, you put it in a place, in a space, and then like how many people walk in, how many minutes do they spend to engage, how long does it take for what you're trying to say to sink in, if it sinks in at all, next day, next week, will they tell that story to the next person? Don't know. No way to find these numbers. But also, I guess, when these objects sort of go to different places, that those numbers multiply, no way to count these numbers. One way or another, perhaps these objects become money, they go into collection. You don't know where this object goes, nowhere. Pero the money, how much you designate to go back to like a campaign, to an organization, how much of that money translates into legal aid, bail money, relief goods, relief operations, printing material for merienda for people, for mobilizing people. These are quantifiable things, but we don't always do it, but it has to be done as well in order to sort of contextualize like what is our part in all of this. If you make a film, where do you screen the film? How much is the door charge? Where does the money go? Go back to the community, go back to making more films. You have to feed yourself, you have to pay everyone. So parang like it's a big question, but at the same time like it's a question that we're always parang trying to answer anyway. Like as Isay said a while ago, parang like our artist sort of just backs out and disappears because it becomes like a heavy managerial task, no? To budget these projects and to budget parang where it goes after. So yeah, it's actually a fun question.
I guess yung sa part ko, sa practice ko, dahil naka-integrate siya in a classroom or like community-based education effort. So parang mas straightforward siguro namin makita yung response kasi it's more like private and intimate. So through their drawings, through their sharings, siguro I guess parang yung small efforts namin might not be that visible all the time, but I'm looking at the future na parang siguro we can see it translate in their farms kapag kasi marami na silang crops tsaka healthy yung
Actually, I think that's the best answer also in terms of like how you see it back in the community and how they practice it, and then like numbers sort of just flatten, and then you see like not quantitative but qualitative, if anything. I mean, then you see them sort of like gather after the presentation and then just discuss amongst themselves. You see them, you watch them relate, and then you participate in this conversation, and then that's something that you cannot quantify.
Yeah.
I think that's a question also for institutions, like you said, when you write grants, or for our museum friends who has to submit numbers before the budget, so it has to submit visitor count, etc. So that's a very non-art in terms of if the artist thinks about that, but that is where also museum friends, cultural workers can help. How do we translate that to numbers without sacrificing integrity or the kind of work that you do? So they have ways. I'm sure that the museum friends has ways of doing this demand of the institution.
Thank you so much.
Thank you also. Last question is from Aldaba.
Hi po. Just super simple question. What would you remind or like tell the young artists, solo artists, who are so used to making their works in their own studio, own, I don't know, things. What would you tell them? What would you remind them? Like, keep in mind while working with others, like doing collaborative projects with communities. Like, what would be some simple reminder to keep in mind?
Siguro, isa sa parang pinaka-important, one of the most important things I ask myself, is the message they're trying to say, dapat ba should it be told to me, or is it something that should enter my work, or where should it stop? Parang, me working as an artist with them, is it something that should remain within our exchanges, or is it something na parang they need me, or we need to like communicate to the world or whoever else, sino pa yung other audience other than ourselves. So so parang is it, or whatever we're developing, is it something, who is the audience of our work? So
No, I mean, like, initially I was thinking, okay, like a healthy practice of criticism, self-criticism, but maybe a good way to ensure that everyone works respectfully of themselves and of each other is to just not waste each other's time, and just be sincere about the work. And transparency was just so chummy. Pero parang hindi totoo eh. Kasi parang we can't all just be operating as individuals in the studios. And we're all sharing each other's stories anyway. And we're learning from each other's, not, even if we're telling our stories, we're learning from the next person parang how to tell our own story. So there is that. I mean, like, I came from art school wherein parang like we had to like put out all these vulnerabilities in adolescent life and paint a painting, you know? So parang like it's also kind of like that, you know, like out after undergrad, and then when you're doing cultural work, there's a lot of negotiating, and there's a lot of diplomacy, and then there's a lot of managing expectations and emotions, and then that also translates into like working within organization or collective.
If the question is specifically about working with indigenous communities or local communities, I would say that your personal positionality is more important than your professional positionality. In a way, what you don't know is more important than what you know, right? So instead of going in there trying to provide something, it's maybe more important to go in there wanting to be changed. Yeah.
Very last question yung thank you for asking that, and for the three panelists for responding to that. So maybe just to synthesize the whole afternoon from Ken's presentation of like a global macro view of what are the things being done outside the Philippines and with resources, of course. Now, we acknowledge that that is a global problem. What we are experiencing in terms of environmental sustainability. We take cue from them, definitely, especially in the museum setting. Where in the international, there are like ecological consultants already. At the beginning of the projects, they consult these people. And what I'm thinking here is that even in our small institutions or organizations, we can also do that, even in UP, because this is a university with different fields. Experts are here already. It's a matter of collaboration. So I think what Ken foregrounds and emphasizes is the need for that collaboration, that we cannot do things really on our own, and that asking what the others also can contribute in your own project, and vice versa. So I appreciate really the how we sort of, or navigated through these questions that are very personal but also emanates into the work that we do, like Isay definitely. And the questions that Sian asks himself are, these are questions that every artist asks in this market-driven platform of not only the art world but definitely in museum, because museum opportunities are very rare as well for artists. And, thank you, David, for sharing the film with us. For those who went earlier, we watched the whole film. So we'll try to find a way on how to share again the film to the UP community. And it opened up the visuality of the Bulwagan and the importance of that idea and tradition and culture that we can always tap into as Filipinos in connecting ourselves with nature. So, thank you everyone for coming to this session. Congratulations. We thank Isay, Sian, and David definitely for sharing all your experiences and insights in all these years of artistic practice, and we hope that we see you again in the near future in future Bulwagan 𝘮𝘶𝘮𝘴 events and programs. Thank you, Bulwagan 𝘮𝘮𝘮𝘮 and the UP Theater.